Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Kathie Sarachild of Red Stockings. I see that you know about Red Stockings, that it went back to for those of you who didn't, it was founded in 1969, and there's a Red Stockings going on today, which you can find out about on the website. I won't go into that now, but it's one word if you Google it, not two. And you'll also learn what the name Red Stockings means. I don't want to take precious time up now. So, good morning, sisters and allies of women's liberation, male allies, of course, participants in this conference to learn from women's liberation's last revolutionary moment some ideas for how to have another one. And one that lasts longer this time and goes further. How's that? The Red Stockings Manifesto of 1969 proclaims, quote, "In fighting for our liberation, we will not ask what is revolutionary or reformist." That did not mean that we didn't want a revolution for women and for all oppressed peoples. We wanted a real revolution, a full one. We wanted full liberation, whatever that takes, and we would learn by trying. Act, reflect, act again. So thank you, Deborah Bell, and all the organizers of this conference, the organizing committee. Let's give them. Yay, it was a wonderful, when we heard about this conference in Red Stockings and National Women's Liberation, the groups I work with, we were thrilled and excited that this was finally happening. And thank you for providing this, what is going to be an opportunity for the reflection of the conference and action afterwards. I feel honored to be asked by the other radical women on this panel to do the tough job and perhaps impossible job of moderating them. I've known them all for decades, and we have stood shoulder to shoulder over the years, not on everything, but on many, many issues and for many actions. And it's exciting to be doing this with them one more time. They've also graciously given me leave to comment, if so moved, but I'll try to restrain myself. The other panelists have been pouring their hearts out into their prepared talks, and all have had to shorten enormously what they'd like to say. When you get older, you have so much to say, it's a problem. And when we were younger, we couldn't quite figure out what to say. But anyway, I'm going to be introducing each panelist, but I don't want to take up their precious time with lengthy introductions. Their bios are on the conference website. You can check them out, and you can read about them there. There will be 15 minutes each for them, and Carol Hanisch is going to help me with the timing. Carol is on the background, but we're going in order of speakers. So just one more thing I want to say. There'll be time for discussion. We've set aside about, depending on how things go, 20 to half an hour for questions. Now, you know, there are a lot of people here. If we're so lucky as to have a lot of questions, we may have to limit the questions and limit the comments. We'll see how many questions there are. And I just want to say, for those of you who don't know what's being distributed, I'm going to be on a Red Stockings and National Women's Liberation panel tomorrow in the morning, and there are a lot of good panels going on at the same time, but I just want you to know about that. Okay, so T. Grace is going to be first. And the first action I did with T. Grace was in 1968. We picketed the New York Times to get them to end the segregated help wanted section.
Ideas have real-world consequences. What I want to do today is to compare the ideas in radical feminism with those in feminist postmodernism, especially as regards two concepts, the first being class identification, and the second, the difference principle. I will illustrate how these two notions played out in the case of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission versus Sears Roebuck, the years 1973 to 1988. The central question for feminists has always been, how does the oppression of women work? Where does it come from, and how is it maintained? We can't dismantle any structures that we do not understand. Effecting change depends first on our analysis of the problem. The period that this conference is devoted to, the late 60s and the very early 70s, was the one in which the very difficult theoretical work, which had never been done before, was begun. This work was never completed. When we embarked on this project of radical feminism in early '68, we faced two apparently overwhelming obstacles. Women have always been oppressed throughout history and all over the world. It seems natural. How could something so universal be explained as an injustice? Radical feminism emerges in early '68 as a response to deeper understandings of women's oppression. Already to speak of oppression instead of discrimination is a significant shift in terms of scope and depth. We needed a more comprehensive analysis of women's oppression than the civil rights model. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex and her structuralist account gave us a start. Beauvoir understands women's oppression by analyzing the particular institutions which define women's lives: marriage, family, motherhood, etc. Family law encompasses several institutions, but some of us determined that the critical point of entry for women is marriage. This involves a state-governed legal contract. The family has no separate contract, although reproduction naturally falls out of the marriage contract under the subconstruct of conjugal rights. I broadened Beauvoir's discussion in order to respond to the question of why, if women were not naturally inferior, our oppression had continued fundamentally unchanged. The traditional institutional analysis accounts for the mechanics of women's oppression, but not the dynamics, that is, what's kept it going. Since women are half the population, these dynamics had to feel intrinsic to women's identity and thus be embraced, not resisted by women. The obvious candidate for this was love, and for men, an obsession with sex and conquest. In late '68, I published an article on the institution of sexual intercourse, which was an attempt to challenge the necessity of heterosexuality, and by implication, those institutions which are based upon this assumption. So radical feminism is a tendency to understand the oppression of women on the deepest possible level. The goal of this analysis is to pinpoint the crucial points at which women might attack the edifice of our oppression as a whole. Institutions are by definition artificial, but no less powerful for that. The notion of a class is artificial in any natural sense, since it is a construct which is meant to do certain work. For the oppressed, class awareness is essential for resistance. It's the commonalities between formerly differentiated individuals which form the basis for solidarity and political change. Oppressed individuals by themselves are relatively powerless. Together, it's a different story. The one assumption no one questioned was that women formed a class, and that this class was an artificial one and designed for political purposes to oppress women. We called this artificial class gender. Our mantra was Beauvoir's dictum, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." This central assumption that women formed a political class and was the bottom half of a sex class system never precluded the existence of other class systems, equally artificial, systems based upon race or economics and so forth. We generally agreed that the sex class system was the first class system and that the other class systems were generated out of this initial bifurcation. Each system was built upon the one before until we had ended up with a pyramidal social structure defined by depriving one group after another of their humanity. The Sears case begins in 1973, when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission filed sex discrimination charges against Sears, Roebuck and Company. Sears was the largest retailer of general merchandise at that time in the United States. This case was not finally decided until 1988, when the Seventh Circuit ruled against the women and for Sears. What were the historical, legal, and political contexts in which this Sears case arose? Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act was the one legislative ground women had to stand upon. and women had won a number of Title VII cases in the early 70s, AT&T, Colgate-Palmolive, the stewardesses, and so forth. In 1973, Roe versus Wade came down. However, if a woman cannot independently support herself financially, she has very few other live options, including reproductive rights. The cases which had been brought initially in the late 60s had all been brought by a few brave plaintiffs, and serious retaliation against them personally always followed. The Sears case broke new ground because the raw statistics concerning the patterns or practices of sex discrimination were overwhelming. Individual plaintiffs did not have to be offered up as sacrificial lambs. The numbers spoke for themselves: five geographical regions, 920 stores, 380,000 employees. Sears was the largest employer of women in the country, and the majority of its salespersons were women. However, although over 60% of the full-time sales applicants at Sears were women, women made up only 1.7% of full-time commissioned sales hires in 1973. The result was that men made 3 times as much as women at Sears. The important distinction here is between non-commissioned sales jobs and commissioned sales jobs. The non-commissioned sales jobs are for small ticket items. These jobs are paid by the hour of piecework. The commissioned sales jobs are for big ticket items and are paid a basic salary plus between 6 and 9% of sales made over the goals set by the company. Women were, of course, tracked into the non-commissioned sales jobs. Sears was the most massive sex discrimination case ever brought, before or since, and we lost it. We lost it because the political climate in which it worked its way up through the courts had shifted, and not for the better. At heart was this issue: did women in fact constitute a political class? This is what the case was about: money and fair play, a woman's equal right to earn her own living on the same basis as a man. What the case gradually evolved into, led by the Sears defense with some help from a postmodernist women's studies historian, was not a human rights issue about equal treatment. Instead, the case was lost because men and women were different. Of course, every individual is different in various ways from every other individual. However, the issue in an employment discrimination case turns on differences related to bona fide occupational qualifications. How are such differences relevant to selling Sears products? This is the question. The Seventh Circuit's judicial decision cited 2 primary justifications for the pay discrepancy between men and women at Sears. First, women did not demonstrate interest in commission sales, and 2, women were risk-averse. The interest angle had to do with the products being sold. Considering that the bulk of Sears' big-ticket items are household appliances, such as refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, clothes dryers, dishwashers, and so forth, it seems strange to assert that women lack expertise with such products or interest in selling them. And what does risk-averse mean? Was skydiving involved? No. The reference to risk involved the fact that commission sales jobs did not have fixed compensation. However, since the compensation, even at the base salary, was so superior to that for non-commissioned sales, where was the risk? Between more and lots more? So the reasons given were not very persuasive, to say the least. Furthermore, the EEOC's case was criticized for the lack of individual plaintiffs, no blood in the water. But the point of the vastness of the Sears case was that the discrimination was so blatantly obvious. Someone would have to claim that women liked being cheated of their just remuneration, unlike men. If women are human beings, then it's safe to assume that they don't enjoy being raped. Well, unless your proposal is that women are just different that way. This is basically what Rosalind Rosenberg, the women's history professor, claimed as a witness for Sears. It's always been this way for women. Ergo, women must have different values, higher values, than do men when it comes to monetary compensation for their labor. Professor Rosenberg must be referring, no doubt, to the Sears Personnel Manual for her evidence in support of this position. Quote, male employees may be granted a day's paid leave when the employee's wife gives birth. However, female employees are not granted a day's paid absence when she gives birth. Can anyone imagine a more perfect instance of unpaid labor? The Sears case is such a travesty that we have to ask how this could have happened and why the women's movement was not clearer about the import of this case. The seminal essay to read for the theoretical underpinnings of this period as it concerns women, using the Sears case as illustration, is Joan Scott's Deconstructing Equality versus Difference, or the Uses of Post-Structuralist Theory for Feminism. That was in '88. In 1975, Simone de Beauvoir warned me in Paris, watch out for the anti-feminist differentialists. I finally understood in the late 1980s what Beauvoir was talking about. Postmodernism is a profoundly reactionary political theory. Postmodernism pretends to focus on words, and on words about words, which it calls discourse. It pretends to analyze discourse through something called deconstruction, but instead words are used to mystify and confuse, and finally to prevent any meaningful steps forward, especially as regards thinking about the world. Words are not facts. It is facts which deny all women our humanity, and it is facts we must change. Women are a political class, the first one. It produced the paradigm for the other class systems of sequential bifurcation of the human species, a bifurcation which is repeated one atop another until every individual is pitted against every other. What makes a political category a class are commonalities. In the case of an oppressed class, it is grievances which are observed and shared. It is only as this class mobilizes around these grievances and forms political groups that meaningful social change can be achieved. It is the differences between us which keep us isolated and ineffective and in despair. But differences are not what we organize around. The fact that postmodernism emphasizes difference gives their political game away. Difference keeps us separate, not together. Postmodernists claim they are post-structuralists, but what does this mean? It means that they reject any attempt to understand how things work, where conditions come from, and how they are maintained. It means, in political and practical terms, putting change beyond our reach. It means thinking in a circle, so that in the end we arrive back at the beginning. But this time we are so worn out from trying to disentangle the postmodernist abracadabra that we lack the strength and morale to start over. Considering the importance postmodernists give to language, they are incredibly sloppy in its usage. Critical terms such as binary and essentialism have no fixed meaning and function, simply as pejoratives. As for the pretentious philosophical posturing, by prefacing their claims with words such as metaphysical and epistemological and meta-epistemological and critical theory, these have no purpose other than to intimidate the reader. None of the ordinary meanings associated with these terms apply, so why use them? Words are not being used to inform or to clarify, nor to build one thought upon another until some explanation emerges. Words are tossed in to impress or to dupe. It is impossible to tell what postmodernists mean because they use the same words to mean different things at different times. For all the emphasis on the importance of language, postmodernism throws away language as a tool of either understanding or of communication. At best, language becomes an end in itself. Women make up 50% of the population. There is no system already in existence on any level, economic or social, that can be tweaked to accommodate such numbers. Here are our options. We can limit our goals to advance a few women up into whatever existing systems we happen to find ourselves in. Or we must understand and prepare ourselves for not only turning the world upside down, but more importantly, inside out. All social relations are at bottom political ones. They can be changed, but it will be much harder than the women's movement of any wave has indicated it appreciates. No gain is forever. Progress has been made on the most radical grounds, has to be made on the most radical grounds, and then constantly guarded. If you need a reminder, consider the right to abortion. We need to protect our collective identity as women. We also need to work with other oppressed groups. Since each oppressed group experiences their oppression in disparate ways, we must avoid the trap of competing victimhoods by identifying common goals which we all need. We could start with the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, but substitute every individual for every family. Women's individual rights should not be conditioned on their existence within a family framework. The most obvious common goal for all individuals is the equal distribution of material goods without regard to merit.
Thank you, T. Grace. Kathie Scarbrough is going to be next. She's sitting on T. Grace's left. And I'll just say that I first met Kathie Scarbrough in 1979. She had invited Carol Hanisch and I to speak at the University of Rochester, where she was an undergraduate. And I think it was shortly, the Random House censored edition of Feminist Revolution had just come out. And in the time after we spoke, she and a few other women started a group on campus called Women for Feminist Revolution. And that's when our relationship began. Yeah.
"1979 was a long time ago. I'm speaking here today. I'm speaking here today from the perspective of a feminist activist, but also as an academic scientist and teacher. I take the position that our focus as feminists should be on sex and not gender. Women's liberation makes our goal clear. The name of our movement identifies male power as a major impediment to women's freedom. Male power holds back all women, white women, women of color, lesbians, rich and poor women, women of imperialist countries, as well as those women who also suffer from neocolonialism. The impartial interest in the genders, however many genders you believe may exist, I understand right now Facebook recognizes 56 of them. This impartial interest in genders suggests that there's nothing special about the position of women in society. Gender is a step backwards towards the old saw that we are all equally oppressed, and that's a lie. The way that cultural expectations based on sex pervade everything that we do and everywhere we go has been examined in great detail. A woman named Lee Bai spoke at a recent conference organized by Red Stockings about how these expectations based on sex were opposed in revolutionary China. She testified that she grew up unaware that she was a female child because at the time, the differences between girls and boys were minimized. They were just children playing with a variety of toys and participating in a variety of activities. Promoting the idea that there is a continuum of human behavior that does not correlate with sex makes meaningless the concept of multiple genders. Gender is derived from and depends on sex. Focusing on gender tends to elevate and invigorate physical differences between the sexes and downplay our common humanity. Another way to define gender is that it's the sex you are perceived to be by others. Technological advances and new understandings in reproductive biology seem to have caused a significant amount of confusion about the definition of sex. Is sex defined by our chromosomes? If so, how can a baby with 2 X chromosomes be born with genitals that look like this? Either chromosomes aren't enough to define sex, or genitalia don't define sex. In fact, neither of these characteristics define sex. Sex in biological terms is defined by gametes, eggs and sperm, produced within organs known collectively as the gonads, the ovary or the testis. But sex isn't even completely defined by the gonad you happen to possess. These patients are chromosomally XY. They have undescended testes located in their abdominal cavity. The testes are functional insofar as they secrete the hormone testosterone, but they do not produce sperm. It's pretty obvious looking at this picture that human bodies are able to metabolize testosterone into estrogens. So sex doesn't correlate with hormones either. Biological sex is about the reproduction of the species, egg and sperm, meeting to initiate the growth of a new individual. So these gametes are how biologists define sex. I know it's fashionable to decry the binary, but sorry, we're stuck with just eggs and sperm when it comes to sex. There are only two types of gametes, and there are no intermediate forms. Gonads and gametes don't get mismatched in the natural world because the gamete is dependent on the gonad for its maturation. So there are no examples of human beings born with an ovary that produces sperm, or vice versa. There are known conditions, for example, the one shown in the earlier figure, where people don't produce either gamete. And some small percentage of human beings are born with an amalgam of an ovary and a testis, with neither gonad or with one of each. However, I know of no cases where a human being makes both functional eggs and functional sperm. Gonads and gametes are what biologists call primary sex characteristics. Most female human beings also have wombs and vaginas. We are the ones who menstruate and gestate. So gender can be viewed as the social signal for either being among the class of human beings whose bodies produce offspring, or alternatively, being among the class of humans who have a much more circumscribed role in the reproduction of the species, the role of sperm provider. Pregnancy, labor, and delivery take a physical toll and removes women, at least temporarily, from the conventional productive forces of the economy. I believe that the subordination of women is rooted in the exploitation of this difference in our reproductive labor. As a result, women's liberation should concern itself with sex. In a few instances, it makes sense to rely on gender instead of sex. Anne Fausto Sterling makes the point that humankind shows much more variation in genitalia than the stereotypical male or the stereotypical female. People born with ambiguous genitalia might actually need to choose whether to represent themselves in the conventional world as man or woman, until such a time when that no longer matters. Therefore, gender might provide an occasionally useful flexibility regarding sex. Sarah Richardson has this lovely diagram in her new book, Sex Itself, which nicely pulls together all this talk of chromosomes, gonads, and the sex one is perceived to be. XX chromosomes for female, XY for male. Here we have the gonads, the ovaries in relation to the uterus and the vagina, or the testes in relation to the vas deferens and the penis. The hormones, estrogens and androgens, androgen being and estrogen as well, being general terms, and the major androgen that most people are familiar with is testosterone. What I particularly like about this figure is how Richardson emphasizes our commonalities by showing that both men and women make both estrogens and androgens. Indeed, the differences between men and women in hormone secretion have always been overemphasized in our culture. Overemphasis of our differences leads to nasty jokes and guilty secrets about the physical attributes of aging women, because when our estrogen secretion decreases significantly after menopause, the effect of our natural androgens becomes more obvious. Many a woman has agonized about beard hairs sprouting from her chin or the darkening of the hair on her upper lip. We pluck and bleach and shave often without questioning the conventional notion that this hair is somehow unfeminine. Or we pluck and bleach and shave with full consciousness of doing it to get along as an individual in sexist society. Indeed, this age-related change is unfeminine, because femininity itself is fictitious. These changes may be unfeminine, but they are not unwomanly. Both women and men secrete estrogens and androgens. We are more alike than we are different. Here's a complementary example of this truth. It's been discovered recently that male fertility is dependent on responses to both hormones. So without estrogen, men are infertile. Again, stressing our common humanity. Today, our self-representation as male or female doesn't have to correspond to one's chromosomes, sex organs, or even whether we produce eggs or sperm. Gender, or our notions of man and woman, are detected by the existence of what we biologists call secondary sex characteristic, those anatomical features that typically appear at puberty. Looking at a person, you can't tell if they have testes or ovaries, but you can sure see whether they have breasts or beard hair. Secondary sex characteristics are controlled by estrogens and androgens, the hormones secreted mainly by the gonads. As we've seen, women and men can respond to both kinds of hormones. Therefore, the currently fashionable cross-sex imbibing of steroid hormones, although probably not very good for one's health, can induce some gender ambiguity. These powerful hormones can be used to alter one's gender, but not one's sex. These hormones cannot change the fact that you've grown an ovary containing eggs or a testis. Estrogens and androgens also target the brain. They initiate menstrual cycles in women and stimulate sex drive in both sexes. An increasing number of people assert that the sex of their brain and their body don't match. As a neuroscientist, I know a good deal about the sexual differentiation of the brain, and I have to say it doesn't go very far. For the most part, male and female brains are quite similar. Several recent books have lambasted the biased research, leading many to conclude that we humans are born with either pink brains or blue brains. Yet the idea of brain sex persists. Human brains are mostly alike, but there is one small functional difference between male and female brains related to the continuation of the species. A tiny part of the evolutionarily old, non-conscious female brain creates a reproductive rhythm, and the corresponding part of the male brain doesn't. The largest physiologically important difference between the sexes is the network of a few neurons that produce reproductive cycles. This tiny part of the brain is known as the hypothalamus, and it's located right here. And the hypothalamus plays a role in the menstrual cycle. In women, the hypothalamus drives elevated levels of a pituitary hormone called luteinizing hormone once a month. These short elevated levels of this hormone stimulate ovulation. The physiological events that follow ovulation prepare the uterus for pregnancy. Men can't menstruate because they don't have a uterus, but just as fundamentally, their brains don't direct the pituitary gland to release hormones on a monthly cycle. Men secrete the very same pituitary hormones in very similar concentrations, but the pattern of the secretion is constant, not cyclic. Again, to emphasize our common humanity, I'll mention briefly that luteinizing hormone is essential for male reproduction also, specifically for testosterone secretion and sperm production. Adult men cannot make their hypothalamus create a reproductive rhythm by taking estrogen. Scientists differentiate between the effects of hormones to, quote, organize brain function during fetal development or to, quote, activate brain function during adolescent and adult life. Parts of the hypothalamus are organized by the hormonal environment during fetal development. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that only gonadal hormones have organizing effects on the brain. Other hormones, like thyroid hormone, organize the brain. But thyroid hormone's effects don't produce a sex difference. So if someone wanted to convince me that their gonads and their sex of their brain don't match, they'd have to demonstrate a mismatch of cyclical hormone secretion and their sex. So a person who grew testes as a fetus would have to demonstrate that their brain still has the ability to secrete luteinizing hormone with a cyclic pattern. Indeed, there are at-home tests that are sensitive enough to detect this possibility. Kits you can buy at the pharmacy to detect ovulation are actually measuring metabolites of luteinizing hormone excreted in the urine. So it's possible for individuals to obtain this evidence. As a feminist and a trained neuroscientist, I don't believe in endogenous gender identity. Many women's liberationists hold on to the ideal of treating human beings as individuals with interests and abilities that don't necessarily correlate with the sex organs. Gender is socially constructed, and social forces can also confuse self-identity, particularly in cases where people don't fit cultural norms. Conventional girl or boy behavior doesn't fit many people. Why not simply conclude that the culturally defined categories, feminine and masculine, are the problem? Collective action is required to fight battles against socially constructed notions of feminine and masculine. It's difficult and maybe impossible to wage this battle successfully as an individual. Certain individuals may make the personal decision that they can't wait for that new day to dawn. But let us be clear, a decision to change one's gender is a personal one. I don't see it as a political act. A personal decision to change one's appearance to reduce friction in life doesn't help our struggle against the power differential between men and women. Indeed, it can be argued that transgendering embraces, supports, and props up the current position of women and men in society, at the same time that it gives some individuals needed relief from the condemnation of not meeting conventional gender expectations. Smashing gender would be a step forward for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, Carol Hanisch is going to be next. Carol and I, although we both were civil rights workers in Mississippi in 65 and 64, we didn't meet each other until Carol moved up to New York as the staff person for an organization called the Southern Conference Educational Fund. We immediately discovered that we had a lot in common. We went to our first New York Radical Women meetings together in 1967 and have been working together and separately, but in spirit and communicating with each other constantly over the years since then.
When I first saw the call for the papers to this conference, I just couldn't believe my eyes. There were the words, women's liberation, late 60s, early 70s, revolutionary, all in the same title. And non-academics were even invited to submit proposals. How brave, I thought. In recent years, most of the academy, with some exceptions, seems to have forgotten all about the women's liberation movement. The radical roots of the 1960s have often been ignored, and it's referred to as a 70s movement. On the other hand, it sort of hurts to hear your life's work referred to as a moment. But we have to face the fact that that's pretty true. Although that enormous wave we created is still being ridden today to some extent, it has largely washed out. Yet every woman at this conference who's employed by women's studies or a related field, or hopes to be, owes her job to the revolutionary moment. The important part of the 1960s, what made them revolutionary, was not sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as so many claim. What made them revolutionary was study, struggle, and organize. It's in all the movements, including women's liberation, there was a serious core out to change the power relationships, not just change ourselves or a piece of the culture or have a good time. That it was only a moment was partly due to our own mistakes, a big topic for another conference, and partly because those who didn't want us to succeed were stronger and better organized, and of course, hugely better funded. When we, the lighting here, causing me problems. When we became successful enough that the powers that be began to see us as a threat, they came after us, not with guns and prison sentences as in other movements, but with well-funded words and ideas to swamp the early women's liberation success. We of the study, struggle, and organized part of the 60s have striven for truth, for looking reality square in the face and telling it like it is in clear language. Consciousness raising was developed as an organizing tool for getting at and understanding the reality of our lives in a collective way. And it was for every woman. You didn't need a college education or even a high school diploma to participate. The words, the terms we used were part of the revolutionary struggle. Often they had links to other struggles. Looking at our language reveals where we came from and our goals. No doubt new terms are sometimes needed, but we must be alert and ask, is this new term really better? Does it cut us off from our history? What is being avoided by not using the old term? If we compared the passionate and galvanizing demands of the late 60s with what passes as feminism today, we see major changes in strategy and goals. The robust cry for women to unite for organized power to defeat male supremacy has all but disappeared. Killing off revolutionary words is a serious thing. The process of putting the brakes on the frightening specter of angry women rising up and making big demands for big changes is reflected in the gradual disappearance of our very name, Women's Liberation Movement. Liberation was the first to go. In fact, it was a partial castration in the beginning, as we found ourselves shortened to women's lib and women's libers. Next came the women's movement, which sounded a lot less threatening with liberation gone, and it certainly was. That word, liberation, was much too radical for academic and foundation funding, so some women became tools in the eradication. Movement was next to go. The movement in this context is a class of people in motion. The women's liberation movement was the masses of women in motion collecting collective power to end our status as the second sex. There were many articles written by women's liberation activists talking about power for women, even a book, Woman Power by Celestine Ware. And oh, that's right, she was a black woman, and we all know that no black women considered themselves part of the women's liberation movement because women's historians have told us so. So what else do the powers that be do, the ones who want to contain us? First, they tell us that power is something unseemly for women to seek. Power is a nasty thing that should be only sought by men. Next, we were told to seek personal empowerment, not the power of women uniting like a union to force social change, but to seek agency, more choice for individual women. If every woman just had enough choices and leaned in the right way, her dreams would come true. Books and magazine articles urging women on to self-empowerment have replaced those early strident feminist tracks against male supremacy. Then came third wave feminism, full of much of the same, the self-involvement, the expressing ourselves, and even sometimes seeking safe places, not with changing the world. Feminism became whatever a woman said it was. Everyone from Sarah Palin to Lady Gaga could call herself a feminist, and who could deny it? We are now in the middle of the erasure of even the word woman, so there will soon be nothing left of the women's liberation movement. The existence of women as an oppressed sex class is being challenged and overridden by gender. If it were in the way that Simone de Beauvoir talked about it when she wrote about how women are made, not born, we could welcome it. But in gender theory, women are no longer considered a sex oppressed by another sex. We exist as a fluid gender. As a gender, everyone can ignore sex class and play around with their presentation to suit themselves. Meanwhile, the categories of women and men can be whisked out of the way without dealing with that pesky root cause of women's oppression. We can eliminate the binary in two ways: end male supremacy and therefore the oppression of women, or eliminate women by substituting gender. On our campuses, what started out as women's studies or feminist studies, inspired by Black studies and fought hard for by the revolutionaries of the revolutionary moment, are now in danger of disappearing into the amorphous gender or sexuality studies. Women's studies contained a good deal of women's liberation content in the beginning. Maybe if they had called themselves women's liberation studies in the first place, as they should have, as that's where they came from, it would have helped keep them on track. Now, women need a purse of her own, as Susan B. Anthony used to say, but we need many other things. Somehow, many people, including those who call themselves feminists, seem to forget that women are the reproductive class, the class that carries and births the next generation of the human race, something the whole of society benefits from. Since the roots of our oppression lie in this female reproductive capacity, this is a dangerous thing to ignore. It is necessary to unite and fight to protect ourselves from exploitation as the world's baby makers. We need men to step up and share the child care and housework, and we need our government to provide the free 24-hour child care, just as it provides kindergarten. We need reasonable paid parental leave and elder care leave. We need a sharing by men and by society of the burden that falls on women because we are still relegated as the caretakers of the young, the old, and the sick. Now, some women have managed to escape that burden, but it is usually because they can afford to hire some other woman, often a woman of color or an immigrant, to do it for them. We need equality whether we have or aspire to have children or not. There are many needs that must be met for women's liberation to be realized, especially for those who want both liberation and children. We shouldn't have to choose between work and having a child, or trying to do it all, or foisting it on another woman. Unfortunately, those demands are no longer front and center as they were during the revolutionary moment, except in some individual organizations. Perhaps we have to spend so much time trying not to get pregnant that we forget that sometimes we might want to be parents. There are many other terms that have been replaced that show the change in goals and strategy. I only have time to go into a few, but I have a handout here, which you'll find on the table in the back, where I go into a lot more of them. It's called the Women's Liberation Movement versus the Women's Liberation Movement Defanged. So let's talk about abortion, now known as choice. Roe v. Wade was handed down by the Supreme Court to placate a loud and feisty movement demanding free abortion on demand and repeal all abortion laws. The placating pretty much worked. With Roe, too much of the movement declared abortion rights won and moved on, leaving behind poor women, rural women, those in the so-called flyover zone, and others without easy access to an abortion. We didn't finish the battle in those areas, and now these are places where the anti-abortion forces have a very strong foothold. Unfortunately for us, Roe was not about every woman's right to an abortion and repealing all abortion laws. It was about the right to privacy. Now, once the mighty abortion rights movement abandoned itself to the wrong-headed strategy of pro-choice, the word abortion, as used by our side, was pretty much taken off the table, making it harder to make demands for abortion once again. Some other terms. Battered women, or violence against women, has become domestic violence or domestic abuse, taking the emphasis off the fact that nearly all batterers are male. This gets in the way of effective solutions. Rape has become non-consensual sex. To see what's wrong with that, just imagine yelling, "Help, I'm having non-consensual sex," instead of "Help, I'm being raped." Rape has a history. In many cases, abortion battered women and rape crisis centers workers have softened their words and divorced themselves from the women's liberation movement because of their need for funding. These centers should be taxpayer funded through the government, but for the most part, they are not. Most are foundation funded. Foundations are a financial tool for rich people to avoid paying taxes on their excess profits and to improve their image while promoting their interests. They give back a few pennies of what they already stole from workers and consumers. In modern capitalism, everything is for sale and exploitation, including women and feminism. Foundation money has played a huge part in defanging the women's liberation movement and radical feminism. Big foundations fund smaller foundations. For example, the Ford, Rockefeller, and other large foundations fund the Ms. Foundation and the Feminist Majority Foundation, which in turn distribute the funds to groups that follow their liberal line that doesn't really threaten the 1%. Corporate funding from such financial giants as Goldman Sachs and the Bank of America also have had their fingers in the feminist pie. You can find this out with a Google search. Neither foundations nor the government will fund revolutionary organizations or projects, so those projects get watered down, both in name and in their practice. It's a terrible dilemma because groups need money to carry on their work, but the work becomes only what the foundations and the wealthy approve of. Worse, this watering down eventually affects even groups that don't get the funds themselves, but have to do with the anti-radical fallout. The only alternative is to depend on donations and/or dues or do grassroots fundraising. Hard as it is to compete with the corporate-funded groups, I wouldn't look to them for any more revolutionary moments in the future, and certainly not for the real revolution that we so badly need. We must also face the fact that universities are not the hotbeds of radical activity that they were in the 1960s. They too depend more and more on corporate grants. This, no doubt, has a lot to do with the austerity being imposed on education funding and huge student debt, but it's not going to get better until we make it better. Academia itself has contributed greatly to replacing the language of struggle with the elitist and often inaccessible language of the academy, which T. Grace already went into. The women's liberation movement itself is not blameless in all this backsliding either. The threads of self-empowerment and individualism, division and disunity were in the movement from the beginning. There were women in consciousness groups, for example, who resisted attempts to draw conclusions, make judgments, and take positions. In fact, the forerunner of the self-empowerment was the so-called liberated woman, if you remember that era when you were to be a liberated woman without women's liberation. It is crucial to study the backlash and how it works so we can defend against it and not repeat our mistakes. To make the revolutionary moment more than just a moment is going to require less sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and a good deal more study, struggle, and organize.
Well, before I open it up, I just want to make two comments. I got a right to comment here. One of them, I want to respond to what Carol talked about, the role that foundation funding has played in defanging the movement. And the conclusion that we in Red Stockings and the action arm, not exactly arm, but we work together and we do because we're a tax-exempt status thing, we're limited. But anyway, we do the writing and publication, and they focus on campaigns and action. Anyway, the conclusion that we both came to, both in theory and practice, is exemplified by this button I'm wearing, which says, dues-paying feminist. And that is that we have to have a movement that's based on the nickels and dimes of working women. And that's why we have this dues-paying feminist button, and that's how we've organized our groups. So that's one comment in terms of what is to be done about some of these issues. Then one other thing I wanted to say is people, I don't remember who it was, talked about the co-opting of terms. I guess it was probably Carol, but everybody has addressed this to some extent. How feminism came to mean anything, really. And Red Stockings was a group that, the first Red Stockings lasted for 2 years. Then it kind of fell apart, as so many of the other radical groups did. We had a huge impact in 2 years' time, ended up in a lot of these anthologies, et cetera, but it fell apart after 2 years. Well, 2 years later, some of us in the original group and some of us outside the original group, like Carol, because she was down in Gainesville at the time, although we were in constant communication about the ideas and everything, we decided to reform Red Stockings. And one of the reasons was not just that we wanted to continue the ideas and build on the experience, but because we had already learned this power of co-optation of general terms like women's liberation and feminism. And we thought Red Stockings is such a unique term, it will be much more difficult to co-opt the way the others have been done. And even though everything is able to be co-opted, really, even Red Stockings, even when you've incorporated to try to protect it, there is a principle, too, that I think extends to everything, even the general terms, and may someday extend to Red Stockings, because who knows what direction it will eventually go in. And that is, these things are defined by their history. So that if you go back to the original sources, right, the roots, in this case, the roots in history, you can find out what women, through the documents, what women's liberation actually meant at that time. And in terms of Red Stockings specifically, you can go back and, if you can find the documents, and we've worked on trying to make some of these accessible, you can see what it originally meant, what it meant, the new one 2 years later meant in terms of what it did, and how did it change the ideas perhaps a little bit, but not all that much. So basically, Brooke Williams, a wonderful radical feminist writer who we can't find anymore, who's kind of disappeared, I think came out with an excellent definition of feminism, which is that feminism is its history. So that you're constantly, every movement has to learn from experience, but you also have to have access to that learned experience, the records of it. So you can keep saying, well, gee, maybe we should go back to this old thing that was given up because we thought it was wrong, but maybe it was right, or part of it was right. So anyway, that's one comment I wanted to make. So now, let's see how much time. We have about 25 minutes for questions. Okay, only 2, so yeah, go ahead. And then we'll get back.
I guess she'll repeat it, because there's no...
You want to come up here? Oh, yeah, all right. It'll take more time if everybody comes up there.
You should just repeat it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we could do the Occupy Wall Street thing. All right.
Thank you for
Yeah,
calling
right.
on me. Thank you. My name's Barbara Love, and my original contribution was to get lesbians accepted in the women's movement, and I spent 4 years and now doing that. In 1971, they finally recognized lesbian as a feminist issue because we wanted control of our bodies, which is certainly what the whole women's movement was about. But that was where my fight was with Betty Friedan and so on. And while I've always attended Red Stockings events, and I'm excited that their revolutionary work continues, I've been disappointed, and I want to hear, in the early days, you dismissed lesbians as not valid members of the revolution, and I want to know if you've revisited that and rethought it. Carol Hanisch, I believe you wrote that paper. Would you address that? Has the Red Stockings revisited their position on lesbians?
Dismissed. Well, I don't think she portrayed it correctly.
You know, I really don't know how to answer that.
Did you hear the question?
She's got a mic. Go ahead.
Carol, you want to go to the mic?
You know, I'm just going to speak for myself because I
Must
can't.
have talked about it in 40 years.
What?
You must have thought about lesbians in the 40 years that have passed.
I don't know quite how to answer your questions in the way you're stating them. I will speak for myself. I'm no longer a member of Red Stockings, and I don't want them to be tarred with my response. But I think basically my big objection to what happened was that the lesbian movement kind of jumped in front of women's liberation in the sense that all these issues of women as a reproductive class got buried. And we may not have articulated that at the time as well as we probably should have. But, you know, there was a lot of tension. And I mean, you have to remember that there were also lesbians who were claiming that we had no right in the movement, we had no right being leaders of the movement because we slept with the enemy. So there was, you know, there was a problem on both sides. And I think, at least for myself, a lot of my response were to those two elements.
Is there any change in attitude in the Red Stockings group or with you over the years? I mean, I understand now you're explaining your position then. What's your position now?
That's still my position. I think there.
Okay.
I'll say something because I'm still, still trying to continue the Red Stockings thing. I agree with what Carol said. There was a time in Red Stockings. This is addressing the question of the change, and I'll be honest here. We consider lesbianism and homosexuality as political things. We don't think it's biological. We think it's a political analysis and a political action and a political organization, and we had political differences with that. And so therefore we thought for a while that we shouldn't let lesbians in the organization. Now there were times when married women weren't let, in some groups wouldn't let married women. We did change on that. Why did we change? Because there's so many important political areas that people can disagree with, and any group is going to have some political disagreements. And if we had a lot of important other things in common with women who were lesbians, those could override the disagreement about lesbianism. So that's a change that we've gone through. Oh, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Oh, the line, okay. Now I think we have to really try. I mean, it would be great to have a discussion, but we don't have time. So if you have a comment, make it very short. If you have a question, make it short.
Well, I wanted to respond. I really appreciate, I think it's very important, the taking on of a lot of the relativism in postmodernism. And it's one of the most damaging and paralyzing things of this new generation and in academia right now, to teach that there is no such thing as objective reality. I agree with you, T. Grace. Facts exist. The reality exists. And right now, I want to, in that spirit, speak to two things. Right now, we are objectively living through a war on women. And I want to highlight, in particular, the assault on abortion rights. It's an all-out emergency. It's as if we were holding a conference on the history of the civil rights movement while they're re-legalizing Jim Crow. And that's what's happening right now, and I want to call your attention. We have issued an open letter to the conference. Most of the people on the panel are part of this, calling for people to respond in resistance, in fighting, to look at the questions of theory posed here, but also to unite in struggling right now back into the streets around abortion on demand and without apology. So please see me about that. That's one thing.
Okay, I think that's enough.
The other thing, I'm very brief.
That's enough.
We actually need.
No, I'm sorry. We have.
20
There's
seconds,
a long line.
20 seconds.
No,
we
I'm
need.
sorry.
We need a revolution,
Let other
and you
people
should
say
also
what
talk to me about that.
Okay, the next person, please. Yeah. Why don't you say your name too? When you ask a question. Yeah.
My name is Anna Ziering. I graduated from Barnard College in 2011. I wanted to say thank you to all of you for all the work that you've done in the past. We really appreciate it, and I know I owe a great debt personally. I also wanted to say Rosalind Rosenberg, despite some of the things that were mentioned about her today, is still at Barnard. She's a wonderful professor. She's encouraging a lot of young feminists to move on. I had a great relationship with her. And I also just wanted to mention that I'm a little concerned about the sex-gender idea that's being presented here. I think the idea of the idea of gametes being an objective truth is true, but I've also done a lot of work in the queer, lesbian, bisexual, transgender movement, and I think that another reality is that people don't see gametes, they see other things, and the fact that a transgender woman could be discriminated against not only for being female or presenting as female, being observed as female, but also for not having ovaries or eggs by women within the movement is really disturbing to me. I don't think empathy is a feminine quality because I agree that femininity isn't real, but I think it should be a human goal. And I hope that as the women's movement, the women's liberation movement moves forward, we can really think a lot more about how we consider sex, gender, and humanity more generally. Thank you.
I think that's well said, but also a little bit vague. I'd like you to point out who among feminists are discriminating against transgendered people because they don't have ovaries or whatever. I don't think that's true. I don't see it.
Well, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess within the movement, I don't want to name any names. The sense that I'm getting from this panel today, and I'm not trying to accuse you personally of anything at all. The tone came across, I think, as, I think that patriarchal oppression against women exists, and in that sense, I think that there is a power structure coming down, acting very much on this class that was discussed. But I also think that that structure contributes to a rejection of people's lived experiences. And I think that feminism of all movements needs to be conscious of those lived experiences. And so saying that you have sperm or you have ovaries, which is scientifically true and definitely important, but I think we can explode that binary on the one side, as the early movement tried to, while at the same time chipping away from it at the other side. I don't think we need to continue saying man versus woman just so that things stay bad enough for the revolution that we do need. I think you can revolt on this side and you can also sort of move on that side. So I don't want to take any more time. I'm going to sit down, but thank you again.
T-Race, yeah, okay.
I think that transgenderism is definitely a human rights issue. I don't think it's a feminist issue. And that's where there's been some controversy. Doesn't mean it's not a human rights issue.
Also, I think everybody agrees that there's a wide spectrum of human behavior. Nobody disagrees with that.
Well, I'll say one thing on this. I agree with what Tigray said, and that is the definition becomes important when you're organizing women as a power base. We certainly wouldn't try to exclude XX men or what is it, egg-bearing men from our groups, but we would exclude sperm-bearing women from our groups by that definition. So again, we're organizing females, and that you can't exclude males from a public meeting, but when we organize our radical power base that's hopefully going to help change this, we do make it females only, but that includes, transgender, whatever they are, the women, the females who become men, we would include. Yeah. Okay. The next question.
Just something.
What a joy this panel is. Just tremendous. Okay. Breath of fresh air. And a lot of good laughs. Thank you. I'm going to my name is Carol Downer, and I work with the Feminist Women's Health Centers. And I saw these historical changes, because we are and are still in the trenches, right on the front of our clinics, fighting the antis, this battle is very real to us at all times. But I think that, and I was so happy to hear, besides the clarifications, the talking about funding and the dues-paying feminist.
By the way, it's on sale
I'm
at our panel tomorrow. Yeah, right.
I'm going to get a bunch, okay. But you know, there's something underpinning the question here regarding, you know, lesbians part in the women's movement and so forth. And I think what needs to be the next step, okay? I don't think that the best political thinking has not yet tackled this, and it's certainly not coming out of academia, period, okay? And that is that there is a patriarchy, patriarchal institutions, there is an enemy, they do have the power, and they are using it. And they are using it to destroy us. And they have, from day one, they have created these divisions through their funding, and they are divided into, there's not a monolith, they have their factions, and whether it's violence against women that get harassed, that got bought off by the LEAA, the law enforcement, the police, in other words, whether it's, you know, the women's studies, which is, you know, right under the direct control of the universities, whether it's, you know, well, let's see, we can just think of so many where the Ford Foundation, all the different, and we who are, in our group, I'm going to hit the pro-choice. I've been working in childbirth for the last few years, and there is a big division between the childbirth movement and the pro-choice movement. And what it is that we get our money from Rockefeller, okay, and the Mellon Foundation and the Sky Foundation, because they think that we should cut out the population so that they, as wealthy people, don't have to share. They don't want to divide the wealth, they just want to eliminate poor people. So the pro-choice movement has willy-nilly come under that. But you know, it isn't just that they want people to have abortions. Anything that will keep you from having a child. Being gay is one of them. So they have funded the gay movement. And in many subtle ways, they have created these types of divisions because, you know, they see that. This gender thing is their latest move, okay? These are not just swings in opinions. And women just didn't stop being interested in feminism. You know, no, there are real forces at work, and they're out there. And let's not see capitalism or communism. I mean, I'm going to say something really heretical here, and that is that the women in the communist countries or the socialist countries, we might think, oh, how lucky they are that they have all their abortion on demand and they have child care, et cetera. And the women there think they really won all those victories. No, the patriarchy there, their idea of a successful society was to make those things possible. And now they're losing them because their population's going down.
Okay,
So, you know,
yeah,
we have
sorry.
to get
Thank
above
you.
it.
Let's have
I'm done.
move on to the next
I'm done,
person.
but
Yeah, thanks.
I don't.
Okay, I think that.
Yeah.
You've
Thank
made
you.
some good points there. You know.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, please say who you are. Yeah. All right.
My name's Alex. I'm just going to try and build off of some of the stuff some of the other speakers said, specifically relating to transgender oppression.
Yeah.
Is this good? Can people? Okay. So there was a speaker who asked why transgender oppression is a feminist issue, and I think it's a feminist issue because there are transgender women. So transgender women experience oppression on the basis of being transgender and also on the basis of being women. And to say that these are separate issues, especially this pertains also another person asked about why lesbians were excluded initially from some of these movements. All of these forms of oppression that are around gender and sexuality, women's oppression, lesbian oppression, etc., have to have the same roots, which I think was pinpointed. Like, obviously it has to do with like reproduction, but more than that, for a lesbian is oppressed because she is defying the traditional standards, which is that, like, oh, women need to be with men and reproduce. And it's the same with, like, anything that's flying in the face of that is railed against. So for women to exclude from the women's movement transgender individuals or gay individuals or even other men is not effective, and it's actually going to hinder the movement. And I also think the idea that, like, all men are oppressors, are, you know, contributing to our oppression, I don't think that's accurate, because if that was true, like, then what are we gonna do? Just like kill all the men and then we'll just rule the world or something? You know, like, I think that we need to understand that even though men benefit from sexism right now, there's, like, if we lived in a society where all people had their liberation, like, they would be better off too. So.
Okay, I think we got the question. You want to answer that?
Yeah,
And I have a comment after.
I had a second part in terms of the transgender feminist issue. There is a conflict around gender. That is, feminists are trying to get rid of gender, and transgender reinforce gender, and that is a problem. That's a problem. So I should have said that before. The other thing is, I think philosophically, if I can put it that way, that there are people imagining that you can dissolve the class of women by multiple genders, etc. It's a political problem. You're not going to imagine it away. It has to be understood, and all the structures that keep it in place have to be gotten rid of. It's artificial, but it's real in our lives, the oppression. So you're not going to dissolve it by saying, well, there are 59 or 99 sexes or whatever, and so it doesn't exist anymore, right? I mean, so there's a problem there. But I do think there is a conflict insofar as transgenderism reinforces gender. Just because you switch genders doesn't mean that you're not still opting for gender as an identity. And that's a big problem for feminists.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, yeah, okay.
Hi, my name's Ann Ferguson. I'm a retired faculty at UMass, and I'm a longtime socialist feminist, which in my mind is not very different than a radical feminist, as if you believe in an autonomous women's movement. And I've admired T. Grace Atkinson for years, and some of the rest of you. I do, however, disagree with you, T. Grace, about the trans movement. I think it's making a monolithic, sort of definition of what that is. I mean, I know young trans people who are challenging the binary and not, wanting to identify as either men or women, and who define themselves as feminists and are very strong in doing that. So the point being, if I think about how Monique Wittig defined lesbians as not women, not men, and that created a challenge to the gender system of the time, and yet the whole idea that women are sex classes, which I support and was part of my theory for a long time, and reproductive classes is still true, then if you're going to make a strong women's movement that has to deal with the reinforcement of gender, by our reproductive differences and by the sexual division of labor, you're going to have allies who are lesbians, who are trans people, who are, not identified identified as either men or women, because women's movement has to work by coalitions. I mean, that's where we came out of the New Left. We have to have that. We were talking earlier about how we had this difficult conversation about race, but it was in different areas because we are segregated by race. And so we are segregated by race, we're segregated by gender. That doesn't mean we have to lose our radical roots and understanding that reproductive class differences are not going to go away just because we're trying to eliminate the gender binaries or gender as a socially constructed category which reproduces male dominance and another bunch of other things. But I think it's a mistake to think that we just look at, say Jan Raymond's notion of the trans empire of, sex constructed, the trans industry of sex, differences as a patriarchal tool. Because in fact, the younger generation who are doing queer theory don't have to be into postmodernism. I totally also agree with the critiques of that as a kind of, defanging kind of movement. And but that we need to support our allies, our younger allies who are challenging gender in different ways, just as we support, and myself as a lesbian feminine, have to support lesbians and gay men and other people who are challenging, the patriarchal structures that oppress us all.
Okay.
I think I would really disagree with coupling transgenderism and lesbianism. Different people feel differently about it, but lesbianism always seemed to me to be a feminist issue. But, not everybody agrees with that. But I think that the idea of saying, well, and coalitions is something else. Sure, coalitions with lots of people with similar goals. But that doesn't mean that it's a feminist issue. That's the distinction I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I want to make one point. This is more about organizing women, but it relates. I was a woman who wouldn't have been caught dead in a women's group before the women's liberation came along. I thought, as a feminist, an individual feminist, I should integrate male groups. So to me, the only reason to have an all-women's group is the issue of women's liberation and the sub-issues that a good case can be made for fall within that, and we prioritize among that. We're an all-female group to end all-female groups. That's what the women's liberation movement is about. We're organizing to end that forced segregation, and our segregating ourselves as a power base is a weapon to end the need for such a power base. So, all right.
Hi, my name is Nancy Erickson, and I can say that I owe my whole life to the women's liberation movement, my entire adult life, because I would have been lost without it. I became a lawyer because there were no women lawyers. None. Well, there were two, sorry. There were two that I could find in New York City in 1969. Now, I want to talk about abortion and ask what we can do about abortion rights outside of the law, because the law is not going to help us. We've known that since Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade did not make abortion available to everybody. It did not make abortion laws disappear, as you have said. It doesn't. You've said that. It did not make abortion laws disappear, and the reason was, as you said, that it's based on a constitutional right to privacy. It is not based on sex discrimination, which is what it is. Anti-abortion laws and attitudes are sex discrimination, not just right to privacy. We've known that ever since Roe v. Wade. And, Cindy Sisler and Jim Clapp wrote a brilliant article at that time, setting forth what was going to happen to whittle down our so-called abortion rights. And every single thing that they said was going to happen has happened. We cannot win using just the law, because we've been told that things involving, by the Supreme Court of the United States, that things involving pregnancy are not sex discrimination, because sex discrimination is you deal with men on one side and women on the other. And they have said that pregnancy discrimination is not sex discrimination because you're discriminating against pregnant people. You were not discriminating against non-pregnant people. And non-pregnant people includes both men and women. That is what we have to destroy. And we can't destroy that now, at least, by law. We have to look to other avenues. So my question is, what other avenues are we going to look to?
Well, I mentioned organizing a dues-paying all-female power base that will analyze, organize, and mobilize. That's my input. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question.
Okay.
Jane. Reinvigorate Jane.
Oh, on the abortion issue. Yeah. In other words, do illegal abortions. Oh, yeah.
We need political resistance. We
They didn't actually do them, I don't think.
April 11th and 12th, there's emergency actions on abortion. People need to be part of this. We have to move millions. You can do alternate sources, you can do Jane, all that's important, but you need to change
You're not,
millions.
okay. Sarah, really, you had your turn to speak. The next person, yeah.
I'm Artemis March, and I'd like to say two things briefly. One is the word always should be struck from our vocabulary, as in women have always been oppressed. Patriarchy has originated in a few areas. You can trace it, it's finite, and we need to understand that we have other roots, and there's been really good research on this. And let's not ever say again that we've always been in this situation. The second...
That's a political disagreement, yeah.
Well, there's historical and prehistorical facts.
There's all kinds of history, yeah, right.
Okay. Number two. I wrote the paper, Woman Identified Woman. I'm the main writer of this paper, and it sort of kicked off the lesbian feminist movement. Now, lesbian feminism is a political analysis of the core of the whole system, which is very different from working on lesbian rights. And that point is not understood very well. I'll be talking about it tomorrow morning and outlining what we said in that paper, because it's an analysis of the core of the whole thing. Thank you.
Okay, now I think I don't want you to speak next. I want the woman behind you to speak next.
I don't get to speak?
Because you've already had a representative of your group speak at length.
I'm actually going to say something different.
The person
I'm not
after
allowed
you.
to ask a question.
I'm sorry, you're the same group as Sansara.
I'm not the same person.
It doesn't matter. No, really, we're going to hear more of the same thing.
I would like to speak. I would like to say something.
No, this woman, we have to end soon. I want to hear the person behind.
I was standing in line waiting to speak. Kathie, I was standing in line waiting to speak. I should let everyone else go first.
Okay, thank you.
So,
okay.
Maybe she can start after me.
That's
Okay.
really wrong.
So,
We don't need censors.
you do really, you're going to say the same thing. But anyway, so I think that I really appreciate the panel. I think that what you're experiencing in some of the questions is exactly what you're talking about in terms of defanging the movement. I think the issue of women as a political class has been completely lost in the last 20 years. And I think the fight between postmodernism and how to identify ourselves as an oppressed group has been challenged over and over again. And I actually think it's related to a class fight, like in terms of economics. Because if you see who's been having the struggle, it's the academia that have been coming down and redefining feminism for working class feminists, for women of color feminists, and it really has undermined the ability for us to organize and unite on common ground. And no feminist that I've ever heard has argued biological determinism, even though we get accused of that all the time. My center in Vancouver, we operate a rape crisis center and a transition house for battered women, and we have done so for 40 years, was challenged on the issue of whether or not we could identify and define our own membership, who we let into our collective. We were a collective, which if you don't know what those are, you should find out. They still exist. And we were taken to the Human Rights Tribunal, and we fought the case up until the highest court in Canada, and we won. So we were able to keep our space a woman-only space, and it was a very difficult fight. And I do think that in America, the history of the women's movement is different, and I urge you to understand the Canadian movement in the context is different. There's things to learn from us, and there's also things we can learn from you, and we have. But I wanted to just say that I think when we're talking about the issue of postmodernism and re-identifying what woman is, that it also is a class struggle, in my opinion. That there is a real difference. Who talks about who women are and who those people are and how much power they have is very different than the women on the ground. And in particular, in the anti-violence movement, the rape crisis movement and the transition house movement in Canada has been largely working class women for the last 30 years. So.
Okay.
My name is Kathie Jones, and I taught at San Diego State University in the Women's Studies Department for about 24 years. And I'd like to ask the young woman who wanted to speak before if she would join me. I don't know what you were going to say, but I'd like to have you share the space with me. And I have one point I would like to make before I cede the floor to you. And that is, I think that the issue of sex is a very important one, and seeing women as a sex class is a very important one, but I don't think that smashing gender solves the problem alone. I'm a lesbian who slept with the enemy for many years and therefore is the mother of several children. I also think that abortion isn't the only issue, nor is reproductive control the only issue. We have to figure out, as someone who influenced my life in 1969 or so, was writing about 1970, what we do with the issue of sex itself, the question of biological difference. Maybe you have something that you want to add. Thank you.
Okay, now we have to make a decision about, I think we're supposed to vacate the room at this point.
Please. This is deja vu all over again.
Okay, but then...
I guess I need permission to speak here.
It's not censorship, it's
so I'm
trying
just
to
going to go
have
ahead
many
and
voices.
say, okay, well, I am one of the many voices that's here. I've come to this conference, I waited in line, and I actually do want to have a conversation with the people on this panel. So I'm going to say what I was going to say before I was told that I could not speak. And I think it's absurd that you would actually silence someone at this conference, someone like myself who's in the movement for revolution. We need a revolution. Look at the objective conditions of women's lives today. This is a war on women. And I wanted to talk about whether people have gotten this declaration, a declaration for women's liberation and the emancipation of all of humanity. This is very much the political theory that we need to actually build a movement for revolution as part of liberating women and emancipating all of humanity. And I wanted to ask, because several people have brought this up on this panel today, but no one has brought up, what about relying on ourselves? What are we going to do to rely on ourselves to actually build this movement? Not through the courts, not through the institutions, but relying on ourselves. And what do people see as what it's going to take to actually end this? And I do want to ask that question to the panel.
Okay, I already spoke to that, so maybe somebody else wants to say something. I talked about dues-paying feminists, building the separate power base, and that. So does anybody have anything to add about that?
Not really. Yeah, we need more. We need more organizations, yeah.
Okay, so the next speaker, yeah.
I'm a little afraid to talk now. and I'm really not good at public speaking, but somebody had said something about before in the audience about, all men not being the enemy. What are we going to do? Kill them all? I agree that there is a real war. I don't think, war is just like some analogy or something. Our lives are being threatened, we are being killed, and our souls are being killed in so many ways. And I don't think people in general in the world are taking this word war seriously. And even when the Congress people say, well, there's a war on women, they're not taking it seriously. And the men, there is not a man in this room, and I have no idea what the men are doing here in this room, and I don't care. I think they should be serving us coffee. I really don't, think they may be well-intentioned, but there is not a man in this room that has not benefited from being a man, whether he chose to or not. And, if he's in this room, he should be waiting on us hand and foot. And while the ultimate goal is, for everyone to be equal and to get rid of all this, in the meantime, no. In the meantime, they need to be actively supporting us by kissing our asses, certainly kissing mine. And they have to prove themselves to be kissing our asses, or yes, they can have their souls killed and their bodies killed and mutilated the same way that ours are being.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's have the last person. I think that's going to be the last person.
Okay, thank you. Basically, I want to appreciate the leadership that you've taken all these. I want to appreciate the leadership. Is that it?
Yeah.
How much
good.
louder?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thank you. That
Okay.
way. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah.
Well done. I just want to appreciate the leadership you've taken all these years, both historically and in the present. There are many things that I agreed with. There are some things I disagreed with. But the essence is that you've stood for something for women throughout the world. And I'm honored to be here with you. And I appreciate the fact that you allowed for controversy and some of the key issues came up that we're struggling with. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that's a nice note to end on. Why don't we? Is there one more person? Okay.
I wanted to thank all of the presenters very much, and I recognize two of you.
Louder, yeah, please.
I wanted to thank you all very much. I recognize that two of you, at least, were some of the authors of Forbidden Discourse, which meant a lot to me, this article that you wrote about the derail that happens with the gender issue. In the 90s, I tried to transition, and I found that I could not identify myself out of sex-based oppression, and it is sex-based, it is not gender. And I appreciate that you're here and that you're speaking up, and I wish that the women that are in the generations after mine could understand what you're saying in the way that I understand what you're saying.
I just want to say one thing, that on the web there's some excellent writing about this by women none of us know. I've been so encouraged. There's wonderful old-time radical feminist criticism you can find on the web about this. Yeah, and young women, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did have a question, which is, I was really interested to hear about this issue at the Red Stockings position on lesbianism.
Can you speak louder?
I was interested in this position that Red Stockings had on lesbians, and I don't exactly know what to make of it completely, but it strikes me that if you understand lesbianism as a political choice, do you understand heterosexuality as a political choice as well?
Is that a question?
Yeah, it's a real
question.
question.
Here's what I say. I think that actually Red Stockings wrote a letter to Off Our Backs. We didn't explain it very much back then, and it was headlined with something, it was given a headline which I think is true. Whether we choose it or not, heterosexuality, by meaning the egg and sperm coming together somehow in machines or whatever, because that's what heterosexuality is when you get down to the root, is we don't have a choice. None of us do. We need children not just for the species, but for our lives. We need a workforce coming up, and when we benefit from our workforce in a communist revolution, we're going to need children, and it's not fair for there to be one group of women who do the childbearing and another group of women. Because we used to say in the early days of women's liberation, if women really had a choice, they wouldn't have children. It's that we're, propagandized into it. And then I came to realize that we don't have a choice, that we must have children for ourselves, for our lives, not even if we'd rather not. And to do it democratically and fairly is going to take women coming together to figure out how to do it democratically and fairly. So that's what we mean.
I have a good suggestion. I want the Pope to get pregnant. Then all of our problems will be solved.
Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. Yeah.